speak to James Bays, our diplomatic editor, who will help us unpack all of that. And James, I think all sides, all the voices that we've heard so far agree that this is a step in the right direction.
Yes, even the US Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who did not vote for this resolution, but she abstained, she said that she supported many of the things in the resolution. Important, I think, to remind you of the key provision of this resolution. The Security Council now calls, and this is binding international law, remember, for the urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days to enable, consistent with international humanitarian law, the full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access for United Nations humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners. So they have now said, they have now voted for not just a pause of a few hours, but something which will be a sufficient number of days to allow the aid to spread out all over the Gaza Strip. Will Israel comply, I think, is question number one.
Yeah, that's the next question. I mean, how do you go about enforcing that?
Well, it is binding international law, but we know there are many Security Council resolutions that are binding international law that Israel does not comply with. But I think it will add added pressure on Israel, particularly as the US decided to let this resolution go through. It could have used its veto. And it's worth telling you, as you talked about those previous resolutions that didn't go through, the previous 4 resolutions, probably the one that was the nearest to going through was the one on the 18th of October. That's when all the countries either voted for or abstained, and the only country that voted against was the United States. It wielded its veto on October the 18th. Well, we've had 29 days since that date, and we know all the death toll figures are probably undercounting, but in that time there have been 7,600 more deaths, and 3,653 of those deaths were children. So very sobering statistic, and what was called for then was a resolution calling for humanitarian pauses. What the US has now allowed, 29 days later, to go through. The objection at the time from the US ambassador, who put her hand up against and blocked that resolution 29 days ago, was that she was unhappy that they hadn't explicitly mentioned Israel's right of self-defense and there was no condemnation of Hamas.
Right.
Well, guess what? Neither of those are in this resolution either.
Right. Let's talk in briefly, if we can, about this attempt by Russia to amend this resolution. Their key point was that they wanted wording that included the phrase sustainable truce. What were the objections there? Why did that not land with the...
Well, that was a call for a ceasefire, and the US has made it clear that a permanent ceasefire is something that it would block. And so I think the other countries that voted against it because it knew that that would be the US veto coming through. Even if those countries did want a ceasefire, they certainly didn't want to have another veto. They wanted to have something that maybe the UN can work with on the ground. Remember, we've heard earlier on today from the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, who has made it absolutely clear that the whole UN system is on its knees right now. There is no fuel, as we've seen the devastating effect that's had on the hospitals. We have people close to starvation. We have the possibility, with so many people crammed into Gaza, of serious disease breaking out. The UN believes that the whole of Gaza City, that part of it that hasn't been completely destroyed, is at breaking point, as is the UN system. And the UN desperately needed this to happen. It is good news, but will Israel comply?
Yes, silence the guns, said Martin Griffiths. James Bays, many thanks for that.